April 20th sheet is going to ask you to identify the properties of mathematics. And in order to do so, you're going to have to use the other two sheets that came with it that were posted that list all the properties. So there's definitions for properties, there's the first page, and then there is the second page. And you'll use these terms to figure out which one it is. So I'm going to put those to the side so I can use them to help me while we do this sheet. So the first one asks you to look at, it says the sum of two numbers times a third number is equal to the sum of each addend times the third number. Okay, that might be really confusing to you to listen to those words and to read those words and understand what it's saying. So I would caution you to not get too caught up in the words. Look at this key part where it says, for example. Okay, that's what I need you to look at is the example. For example, on number 1, A times B plus C equals A times B and A times C. So you've got to figure out what happened there. So what I see happening here is the A was distributed to the B and the A was distributed to the C. So we had A times B plus A times C. So when I look at my sheets of all of my properties that they gave me, that one would be the distributive property. Whoops, sorry about that. Distributive property. Okay, so I'm gonna say distributive property for this one. And this is kind of hard, but look at the example, and it promise you that that example, when you look at our sheet right here, when you see distributive property on the sheet, which is right here, it has the exact same example. So this is saying the exact same thing. All right, let's look at the next one. Number 2 says, when 3 or more numbers are multiplied, the product is the same regardless of the order of the multiplicands. For example, this is where it's really important to look. For example, A times B times C equals A times B times C. So what is the difference between what's happening here in this first half of the equation and what's happening here? So what's happening here is we have A and B inside the parentheses, but it still is A times B times C, and afterwards it's A times B times C, but we have B and C in the parentheses. So they changed the way that they grouped things. So if you look at the list, if you remember the grouping one is your associative property of multiplication. So associative, and then we'll just put property of multiplication. All right. So look at these examples. That's going to make that easier for you. So I'd go through and highlight them or underline them, however you want. And then look for them on those two sheets, because those sheets are going to help explain that for you. Some of those you might remember. Associative property talks about grouping. Commutative property talks about the change in the order. Distributive property we've just talked about. That's when you distribute the number on the outside to two numbers inside the parentheses, or three numbers. The identity property is when you add, identity property of addition is if you add 0 to any number, it's going to give you that number. And if you do identity property of multiplication, if you multiply any number by 1, you're going to get that number as well. Additive inverse of a number, if you add the positive number to the negative number, it's going to give you 0. So positive 1 plus negative 1 is going to be 0. That would be an example there. Multiplicative inverse is that if you multiply the opposite, like the reciprocal, so if it's 2 over 1 times 1 over 2, it's going to give you 1. And then addition property of 0, if you add 0 to a number, you're going to get that number. If you multiply property of 0, if you multiply 0 times a number, you'll get 0. And then it continues on the properties of equality. And those are a little bit more difficult, but I think if you read through them, you'll understand better by looking at those examples. But the main ones that you probably remember are those ones I just went over: associative, commutative, the distributive properties, identity, inverse, property of zeros, those ones are the ones you're probably most familiar with, but use those sheets as a guide as you do these.